A bipartisan group of American senators just introduced a bill that could slap tariffs of up to 100% on some of the largest economies on Earth, and the entire justification comes down to one single issue: Russian oil. On July 14, 2026, lawmakers on Capitol Hill formally unveiled legislation targeting 5 countries specifically: India, China, Slovakia, Hungary, and Azerbaijan, the 5 largest remaining buyers of Russian oil in the world. If this bill becomes law, President Trump would gain the authority to impose tariffs ranging anywhere from 0 all the way up to 100% on these nations, depending on how much Russian energy they continue purchasing. And here's what makes this moment genuinely significant. A White House official has already confirmed that Trump supports this bill. This isn't a symbolic gesture from Congress that the administration might ignore. This is legislation the president himself has already signaled he's ready to use. Today, we're breaking down exactly what this bill does, why it represents a dramatic scaling back from an even more extreme proposal introduced just months earlier, why it's tied to the memory of a senator who died before seeing it introduced, and what a 100% tariff on countries like India and China would actually mean for the global economy if Trump decides to pull the trigger. Stay to the end, because this bill isn't just about pressuring Russia anymore. It's becoming a real test of how far the United States is willing to go in weaponizing trade policy against some of its own major economic partners. Let's start with exactly what this legislation does, because the specific mechanics matter a lot here. According to reporting, the bill was formally announced on Capitol Hill by Senators Richard Blumenthal and Jeanne Shaheen, alongside Republican Senators Roger Wicker and Katie Britt, along with more than a dozen additional lawmakers from both parties. That bipartisan lineup is worth noting immediately, because trade and tariff policy in Washington has become an increasingly partisan battlefield in recent years. A bill drawing support from senators across the political spectrum signals a level of shared concern about Russia's continued oil revenue that transcends the usual party line divisions on economic policy. The legislation specifically targets what it identifies as the top 5 buyers of Russian oil: India, China, Slovakia, Hungary, and Azerbaijan. Under the bill's framework, Trump would be granted the authority to impose tariffs of up to 100% on these nations, with the exact rate left flexible and dependent on specific circumstances, rather than a single fixed penalty applied uniformly across the board. There's an important carve-out built into this bill that's worth understanding, because it shows the legislation isn't a blanket punishment aimed at anyone who's ever done business with Russia. According to reporting, the bill specifically exempts 15 European countries that continue importing Russian natural gas, even though those countries are technically still buying Russian energy products. Lawmakers behind the bill argued that gas purchases by those specific nations represent only a small share of their overall energy needs, and that those countries have been steadily working to reduce their dependence on Russian supplies over time. That distinction between nations making a good faith gradual transition away from Russian energy versus nations like India and China continuing large-scale Russian oil purchases without any comparable reduction trend appears to be the core logic separating who gets targeted under this bill and who doesn't. Now, let's talk about how dramatically this bill has already been scaled back, because understanding its earlier version tells you a lot about the political negotiating process that produced what's actually on the table right now. Back in January 2026, an earlier draft of this same broader legislative effort proposed something far more extreme: a blanket 500% tariff on any country continuing to purchase Russian oil, gas, or uranium. At the time, Trump reportedly gave that earlier 500% version his green light, with Senator Lindsey Graham, the bill's chief architect, announcing that a Senate vote could come as early as the following week. Graham's own public framing of that original version was blunt, describing it as a bill that would allow Trump to punish countries buying cheap Russian oil that continues fueling what Graham called Putin's war machine. That original proposal named India, China, and Brazil specifically as its primary intended targets. But that 500% version never actually made it through the full legislative process into law. Instead, senators have now unveiled this considerably softened version, cutting the maximum tariff rate down from 500% to 100%, while simultaneously giving the president more flexibility in exactly how and when to apply it, rather than mandating an automatic fixed penalty. There's a genuinely somber piece of context behind why this bill looks the way it does right now and why it's being introduced at this specific moment. Senator Lindsey Graham, who spent nearly 2 years personally negotiating and pushing this legislation forward, passed away before seeing this revised version formally introduced. According to reporting, Senator Blumenthal, the lead Democratic co-sponsor working alongside Graham throughout that process, stated that the White House had already agreed to this revised, scaled-back framework before Graham's death. Colleagues on Capitol Hill have repeatedly credited Graham as the driving force behind the entire effort, and the legislation itself has reportedly been informally referred to by some of his fellow senators as the Lindsey Graham Russia Accountability Bill, a tribute to the 2 years of work he put into building bipartisan support for exactly this kind of economic pressure campaign against Russia's energy revenue. Let's talk about what this bill actually covers beyond just the tariff mechanism itself, because the legislation reaches considerably further than trade policy alone. According to Senator Blumenthal's own description, the bill goes well beyond tariffs, also imposing what he called full blocking sanctions on large parts of Russia's economy, specifically targeting its energy and financial sectors directly. Beyond the tariff provisions aimed at countries like India and China, the bill also proposes sweeping sanctions directed at Russian President Vladimir Putin himself, senior Russian government officials, Russian financial institutions, and Russian energy infrastructure more broadly. That's a significant detail, because it means this legislation isn't simply a trade policy tool aimed at pressuring third-party countries into changing their purchasing habits. It's designed as a much more comprehensive economic pressure campaign, hitting Russia's own financial and energy systems directly, while simultaneously squeezing the external revenue streams, like oil sales to India and China, that have helped Russia's economy absorb years of previous Western sanctions. Now let's put some real numbers behind why India and China specifically ended up at the center of this bill, because the scale of their Russian oil purchases genuinely is enormous. According to reporting citing the Helsinki-based Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, in a single recent month, China paid Moscow more than $7.2 billion for Russian fossil fuels, while India spent roughly $3.6 billion on its own Russian energy imports during that same window. Separate reporting citing the Times of India noted that India relies on Russia for around 35% of its total crude oil imports, with that dependence actually reaching a 2-year peak earlier this year. Taken together, India and China now account for roughly 70% of all of Russia's energy exports combined, according to reporting. That figure alone explains why any serious American effort to cut off Russia's oil revenue has to grapple directly with these two specific countries. You simply cannot meaningfully choke off Moscow's energy income while leaving its two largest customers, representing the overwhelming majority of its export revenue, completely untouched. It's worth walking through the history of how Washington's approach to India specifically has already evolved well before this new bill, because it shows this isn't coming out of nowhere. Back in August 2025, Trump signed an executive order imposing an additional 25% tariff on Indian goods specifically tied to India's continued purchases of Russian oil, a penalty added directly on top of a previously announced 25% tariff, bringing India's combined total tariff burden to 50%. In his own public comments at the time, posted to social media, Trump described India as a friend while simultaneously criticizing what he called India's strenuous and obnoxious trade barriers, framing the additional tariff explicitly as a response tied to Russian oil purchases. India's own government pushed back forcefully, describing the tariffs as unjustified and unreasonable, and vowing to take what officials called all necessary measures to protect the country's national interests and economic security. Indian security analyst Commodore Uday Bhaskar offered a particularly pointed critique at the time, describing Washington's approach as a unilateral and abrasive weaponization of trade tariffs, characterizing it bluntly as a form of intimidation, and noting that trust in Washington had fallen considerably as a result. Separately, Amitabh Mattoo, dean of the School of International Studies at Delhi's Jawaharlal Nehru University, put India's position even more directly, stating that the country will not be bullied by tariffs, tantrums, or threats. China's situation under this evolving pressure campaign has followed a notably different track than India's. According to reporting, when Trump signed that August 2025 executive order raising India's tariffs, specifically over Russian oil purchases, China, despite also being a massive buyer of Russian crude, was not included in that particular order. It's worth sitting with for a moment, because it highlights something important about how this pressure campaign has unfolded in practice versus how it's been described in political rhetoric. China buys even more Russian oil than India in dollar terms, according to the CREA figures cited earlier. Yet it took considerably longer for Washington's actual tariff actions to formally include Beijing alongside New Delhi. This new bipartisan bill, by explicitly naming China alongside India as one of the top 5 targeted countries, represents an attempt to close that gap and finally bring China's Russian oil purchases under the same kind of direct economic pressure that India has already been facing for the better part of a year. There's also a separate diplomatic track worth understanding, because Trump had been pursuing this same basic goal through an entirely different channel just weeks before this bill was formally introduced. According to reporting from September 2025, Trump had specifically asked the European Union to independently impose tariffs of up to 100% on China and India over their Russian oil purchases, framing it as a collective, coordinated pressure campaign rather than unilateral American action alone. At the time, Trump reportedly told senior US and EU officials that Washington was ready to move immediately, but only if European partners agreed to step up alongside the United States simultaneously. That earlier push for coordinated EU action suggests the 100% tariff figure now written into this new bipartisan Senate bill isn't a randomly chosen number. It reflects a specific pressure point Trump had already been trying to build international consensus around for months, well before Congress formally began working this exact figure into actual legislative text. Let's talk about why this entire pressure campaign matters so much strategically beyond the raw dollar figures involved. According to lawmakers behind the bill, the entire justification rests on a fairly direct economic logic. Russian oil revenue represents one of the single most important funding sources keeping Moscow's broader war effort in Ukraine financially sustainable. Every barrel of discounted Russian crude that India or China purchases represents real revenue flowing into the Kremlin's coffers. Revenue that can be used to fund continued military operations, missile and drone production, and the broader war machine that's been striking Ukrainian cities throughout this entire conflict. From that perspective, tariffs aimed at India and China aren't really about punishing those countries for their own sake. They're designed as an indirect lever, using the economic relationship between Washington and two of the world's largest economies, specifically to make continued Russian oil purchases, so financially costly that both countries are eventually forced to significantly reduce or abandon them altogether, cutting off a critical revenue stream for Moscow, without the United States needing to take any direct military action against Russia itself. Now let's think through what actually happens if Trump does decide to use this authority at anywhere close to the full 100% rate, because the potential economic consequences here are genuinely enormous. A 100% tariff effectively doubles the cost of every targeted good entering the United States from that country, a penalty so severe it would functionally price most Indian and Chinese exports out of the American market entirely for as long as the tariff remained in place. Given that India and China both represent absolutely massive trading partners for the United States across countless industries, from electronics and pharmaceuticals to textiles and industrial components, a tariff at that scale wouldn't just hurt New Delhi and Beijing. It would almost certainly drive up prices for American consumers and businesses that rely on goods and components sourced from those two countries, creating exactly the kind of inflationary pressure that tends to become a politically sensitive issue domestically, regardless of how justified the underlying foreign policy goal might be. That's likely a significant part of why the bill's final version grants Trump flexible authority ranging from 0 to 100%, rather than mandating an automatic fixed 100% penalty across the board. It gives the administration room to calibrate the actual pressure applied based on how negotiations unfold, rather than locking in the most economically disruptive possible outcome from day one. Let's also consider how India and China are each likely to respond strategically if this bill does eventually become law and Trump begins actually implementing meaningful tariff rates under it. India has already demonstrated, through its reaction to the earlier 50% tariff imposed in August 2025, that it's prepared to publicly resist and characterize this kind of pressure as unjustified bullying, while still, notably, continuing to import substantial volumes of Russian crude despite the existing penalty. That suggests India's calculus around energy security and cost savings from discounted Russian oil has, at least so far, outweighed the economic pain from the tariffs already in place. Whether a full 100% tariff changes that calculus meaningfully, or whether India continues absorbing the cost while publicly protesting the policy, is one of the central open questions hanging over this entire bill's real-world effectiveness. China's response is harder to predict with confidence, given that Beijing has, until now, largely avoided being directly targeted by this specific tariff mechanism the way India has. How China's government chooses to respond to potentially being included in a 100% tariff regime for the first time, whether through direct retaliation, diplomatic negotiation, or simply absorbing the cost while continuing its Russian oil purchases unchanged, will likely become one of the most closely watched developments in the broader US-China economic relationship over the coming months. Let's be honest about the significant uncertainty still surrounding this entire story, because a bill being introduced in Congress, even one with confirmed White House support, is genuinely different from a bill that's actually passed both chambers and been signed into law. As of this recording, this legislation remains in the early stages of the formal congressional process. It has been introduced and publicly announced, and it carries confirmed backing from a White House official speaking on behalf of the administration, but it has not yet passed the Senate, has not yet passed the House of Representatives, and has not yet been signed by President Trump. Bills with even strong bipartisan sponsorship and executive branch support can still face delays, amendments, or fail to advance at all, depending on how competing legislative priorities and political dynamics play out over the following weeks and months. That's exactly why it's important to describe this accurately as legislation that could impose these tariffs, rather than tariffs that have already been enacted into binding law. Let's walk through exactly what still needs to happen for this bill to actually become enforceable law, because understanding that process helps set realistic expectations for how quickly or slowly this could actually take effect. After formal introduction A bill like this typically needs to move through committee review in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, where lawmakers can propose amendments, hold hearings, and negotiate changes to the specific language before it ever reaches a full floor vote. Given the bipartisan sponsorship already secured, including Republicans Roger Wicker and Katie Britt, alongside Democrats Richard Blumenthal and Jean Shaheen, this bill likely has a smoother path through committee than more contentious, party-line legislation might face. But smoother doesn't mean guaranteed or immediate. Even bills with confirmed White House backing and broad bipartisan sponsorship can still take weeks or months to actually clear both chambers, especially if competing legislative priorities, budget negotiations, or unrelated political disputes end up crowding out floor time. Once passed by both chambers in identical form, the bill would then need Trump's signature to become law, at which point the tariff authority it grants would become active, though the administration would still retain discretion over exactly when and at what specific rate, anywhere from 0 to 100%, to actually apply it against any given country. It's also worth placing this bill within the longer history of Congress using this specific tool, sanctions legislation targeting countries doing business with Russia, because it's not the first time lawmakers have tried this approach. The Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, commonly known as CAATSA, passed back in 2017 with overwhelming bipartisan support, and it established a broad framework for imposing sanctions on countries and entities conducting significant transactions with Russia's defense and intelligence sectors specifically. That earlier law demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of this kind of secondary sanctions approach. It gave Washington real diplomatic leverage in some cases, but it also created persistent friction with allied and partner nations who found themselves caught between their own economic interests and American sanctions policy. This new bill, focused specifically on oil purchases rather than defense transactions, represents an evolution of that same basic secondary sanction strategy, applied to what's become the single largest funding stream keeping Russia's war economy afloat: its energy exports. Before wrapping up, it's worth being clear about where the figures and quotes in this video actually come from, since a story involving multiple overlapping legislative proposals across nearly a year benefits from careful sourcing. The details of this new bipartisan bill, its formal introduction, its sponsors, and its scaled-back 100% tariff cap come from the Tribune, Republic World, and Bloomberg, all reporting within the past several days. The earlier January 2026 version of the bill proposing a 500% tariff, along with Senator Graham's own public comments at the time, comes from FinViz's news coverage and The Independent's reporting from that same period. The historical tariff figures on India specifically, including the August 2025 executive order and the reactions from Indian officials and analysts, are drawn from Iran Press TV's coverage, citing Indian government statements and the Associated Press's own reporting on the executive order itself. Where figures came from third-party research organizations, like the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air's oil purchase estimates, we've attributed those directly rather than presenting them as independently verified numbers, since that organization's methodology, while widely cited by major outlets, represents its own specific analysis rather than official government trade data. There's one more angle worth considering before we close out, because the consequences of this bill, if it ever gets applied at meaningful scale, wouldn't stay contained to just the 3 or 4 countries named in the legislation. Global oil markets are deeply interconnected, and India and China's massive purchases of discounted Russian crude haven't just been financially beneficial to Moscow, they've also functioned as a kind of pressure release valve for global oil prices more broadly. When Russian oil, sold at a discount due to existing sanctions, gets absorbed by huge buyers like India and China instead of sitting unsold, it effectively removes a major source of potential price volatility from international markets. If tariff pressure under this new bill actually succeeded in forcing India and China to significantly cut back their Russian oil purchases, that oil would either need to find other buyers at similarly discounted rates, get sold at a steep loss, or simply go unsold, none of which would be a straightforward, painless outcome for global energy markets. It could mean India and China shifting toward purchasing more oil from other producers, instead potentially driving up demand and prices across the broader global market as 2 of the world's largest oil consumers suddenly compete more directly for non-Russian supply. That's the kind of second-order economic consequence that rarely makes it into the initial headlines about a tariff bill, but it's exactly the sort of ripple effect that energy analysts and international markets will be watching closely if this legislation actually moves from a proposed bill into real enforced policy. Let's go back to where we started. A bipartisan group of senators, honoring the unfinished work of a colleague who spent nearly 2 years building support for exactly this kind of pressure campaign, just introduced legislation that could grant President Trump the authority to impose tariffs of up to 100% on India, China, and 3 other countries specifically because of their continued purchases of Russian oil. It's a dramatically scaled-back version of an earlier proposal that would have imposed a blanket 500% tariff. But the underlying goal remains exactly the same, using America's enormous economic leverage to choke off the oil revenue that's been helping fund Russia's war in Ukraine. With India already having absorbed a 50% tariff burden since last August and continuing its Russian oil purchases largely unchanged, and with China facing the real possibility of direct American tariff pressure over this specific issue for the first time, the next several months are likely to reveal whether economic pressure at this scale can actually change the purchasing behavior of two of the largest economies on Earth, or whether both countries simply continue absorbing the cost, while their energy relationship with Moscow carries on largely as before. Thank you for watching. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly how significant this bill actually is, make sure to like the video and drop a comment letting us know what stood out most, whether it's the scaled back 500 to 100% tariff reduction, the connection to Senator Graham's final legislative effort, or what a full 100% tariff on India and China could actually mean for global trade and prices here at home. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking whether this bill actually makes it through Congress and gets signed into law, because based on how quickly this specific pressure campaign has already evolved over the past year, this story is very likely to keep developing fast.